Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Dispatchers of Reddit, what's a call you've taken on the non-emergency line that was most definitely an emergency? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I've taken many legit emergencies on the non-emergency line. Most memorable was a lady who shot her husband and just called us to collect the body. What always shocked me was when it was busy and I would ask, is this an emergency or can you hold? People would always say they could hold, but then have legitimate emergencies, like your stab wound cannot hold. I've often found that in shock, people tend to get hyper-focused on one detail and leave out vital ones. I used to work for 111, which is the non-emergency medical line here in the UK. I once had a call from a carer for an elderly lady who was wheelchair bound and pretty much immobile. Upon taking the call, one of the first questions I ask is, can I possibly speak to the patient? Which is normally a quick yes or no. The carer for a good couple of minutes before deciding, no, I couldn't speak to the patient. Her reasoning? The patient couldn't breathe and was turning blue. Not a dispatcher, but got a call about a noise disturbance from a farm at the edge of city limits. Turns out a party had gotten hijacked by a tweaker who thought it was a good idea to break into a house full of teenagers. Turned into a 3-hour hostage situation. Guy crashed when the drugs left his system. Nobody got hurt. Had a guy tell me on his way to the ER and asked if we have a wheelchair waiting for him because he thinks he will pass out as soon as he shows up. Turns out he cut his hand clean off and was driving one-handed, bleeding all over the place to the ER. Dude even picked up his hand and put it in his jacket pocket. That's good. A friend and I were walking my dog past a local elementary school over winter break when we thought we heard a fire alarm ringing and faintly smelled smoke. We figured we were both just over-imaginative since nobody was around or seemed to be concerned. An hour later, as we were walking back, we passed the elementary school again and the alarm and the smoke smell were still there. We decided to call the non-emergency line since nobody else in the surrounding neighborhood seemed to have noticed anything, and we didn't want to look like teenagers pulling a prank. Operator answered, and after we explained it to her, she said, wait, you're telling me you think an elementary school has been on fire for the past hour, and you didn't consider that an emergency? The fire was pretty small, and there was no structural damage, but yeah, that was not a smart moment. I've never even told my mother that I'm one of the unnamed sources that alerted the authorities to a fire in a local elementary school. It is a secret my dog and I will take to our graves. One of my instructors in AIT told us a story about how they were responding to a call where the patient was complaining about chest pain. For obvious reasons, he and the other EMTs were preparing for some sort of cardiac issue. They get to the scene just to find out that the patient's chest pain was due to gunshot wound in his chest. This technically doesn't fit your criteria, since chest pain is also an emergency, but I figured it fit well enough. It did. Well, the caller isn't wrong. A gunshot wound to the chest would lead to chest pains. I work in emergency road service. I got a call for a lockout where a disabled woman was locked inside her car because of electrical issues. Because she had some kind of electronic assistance for getting in or out of the car and the car was dead, she was stuck. It was snowing to beat the band and non-emergency response times was 4 hours. It was 20 degrees out. I told her to call 911 and she absolutely refused to do it. It's usually old people. It's not an emergency, but I fell 10 hours ago and have just now been able to crawl to the phone. Just need some help getting up. Oh, and please don't have them using all their lights and sirens. I don't want to wake the neighbors. Or, oh, I'm just having chest pain and can't really breathe right. Just want someone to come check me out. Or, my husband hasn't been able to have a bowel movement in a while, and now he's having a really bad stomach pain. They usually downplay things that can go really, really bad for them really fast. I think they feel embarrassed or like they don't want to be a nuisance. Almost 10 years in 911 here. I think it's about a 50-50 split for emergencies take on 911 lines versus non-emergency admin lines. Shock does really weird things to people, and some people panic and call in emergencies that aren't emergencies to any rational person, but the caller isn't thinking rationally. I've taken calls for suicide by firearm, rollover accidents, and house fires on non-emergent lines only to turn around and answer a 911 line for something like, my neighbor's dogs are barking and won't shut up. Used to work for the 111 service, which is supposed to be non-emergency. The most memorable ones was when a guy's wife just fell asleep. Yeah, she was dead. Another one was a mom called us after her 18-month-old wouldn't wake up after she dropped it down a effing flight of effing stairs. Edit. I forgot to add she was contacting us about 7 hours after it occurred. One was a guy whose mom called us and she had some concerns for her son's mental health. Gives me the number, so I give him a call. All I hear is, edit, it was her daughter-in-law's number, if I recall correctly. He's got a knife, please my baby. And then the call cuts out. Everything turned relatively fine according to the call notes. A call from a phone box from a guy saying he was taking some drugs, he wouldn't say which, with his friend, who then had an overdose and started foaming at the mouth and went a funny color, so the guy ran away. I asked when this occurred, to which the guy responded, about 15 minutes. I never found out what the specific outcome was, but let's be honest. Plenty of strokes, heart attacks, kids drinking bleach, basically anything and everything you could imagine. You'd be calmly asking questions while frantically gesturing the universal phrase for, "Why the F are you calling us?" Not a dispatcher, but I called about a lost dog near the beach one summer. The dispatcher asked if it had a collar, what breed it was, etc., and we eventually realized it was a coyote. For bonus points, when animal control and the cops showed up, they told me it had rabies. Thankfully, it was early enough, nobody was at the beach yet. Not a dispatcher, but a paramedic. We got a call for a fall, and the patient only needed help up. Per dispatch notes, reporting party said patient was breathing, conscious, and was at her normal mental status. We didn't run lights and sirens due to no apparent life threats and the relatively short distance, under 2 miles with light traffic. Get inside. Patient is having a full-blown stroke. She's unresponsive and was struggling to breathe. The wall right next to her head had a hole that busted through the drywall. Patient ended up having a hemorrhagic stroke, and it was believed to have happened when she hit the wall. We took her home on hospice a few days later. Still annoys me to this day about the whole situation, but you live and you learn. However, there's not much we or the hospital could have done. Family honored her wishes and asked for comfort measures. A family called in because the elderly grandmother had injured her leg. They couldn't quite describe how it happened, but somehow, this poor lady's femur was broken and sticking out of the skin. Evidently, this led to charges for elder abuse or neglect, and I can only guess they called the non-emergency line to downplay the severity. I don't want to be a bother, but I've been on the floor for 4 days, and I haven't had anything to eat or drink, and nobody has a key but me. I just need a bit of help off the floor. He'd managed to crawl to the phone and kick the table till it fell on the floor. He was so dehydrated, he spent a week in intensive care. I work for the fire service, so we get a lot of emergencies. I had an old lady call once and very calmly said, "I have a small fire in my kitchen." We sent a couple of fire engines and building fully involved in fire. In the time between taking the call and arriving, the fire shouldn't have taken the whole building. They reckon from CCTV that her call was made when the whole house was already alight. She was just super chill about the whole thing. Also had a very calm caller to a fire outside near a village, and when we got there, it was a fully involved recycling center on fire. Building was massive and full of the sort of thing you don't want to be on fire. It happens surprisingly often, especially from other emergency services. Police will pass a minor RTC and we will turn up and it's 3 lorries, 2 cars, a fatality, air ambulance required, the works. Honestly, it never ceases to amaze me. Actually a dispatcher. Entire company was BLS, so generally only non-emergencies. Caller called to say that a man was attacking a woman outside. What she meant to say was the man had attached screwdrivers to a glove Wolverine style and was punching this woman in the face, leaving perfect circle holes all over her face, all for her purse at 5 in the morning. She survived. One time I called 311 because a guy had a handsaw and was cutting down a tree along the sidewalk of Clark Street in Chicago. The 311 operator said she was connecting me to 911 and I tried to say it wasn't a big deal, just send someone when you can, etc. She interrupted, "You're telling me that a man with a saw is on Clark Street and showing signs of being nuts? Yep, 911 please." There are plenty of times that people call in underestimating the severity of the patient's symptoms, but what's more frustrating is when people call the non-emergency line and immediately demand an ambulance. It's like, you know what the emergency number is. If you think it's an emergency, call them, you dimwit. Not me, but someone I know. We have this thing called, oh boy, Arts Funkdienst, which is a non-emergency hotline where you can call on weekends and workdays from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. if you're sick and want a visit from a general practitioner. It's to keep the ambulances away from too many non-emergency calls. Usually, people wait around 30 minutes to 4 hours depending on workload. One day, a retirement home nurse, not sure if it's an actual nurse or someone else, calls and tells our dispatcher someone coded and they are providing CPR. The dispatcher guided them while also connecting to the main ambulance service. Just before he could connect them, they also told him their building is on fire. In the end, the one guy coding was declared dead, but no one else was hurt. Never heard what exactly happened or if the fire and CPR were related. Erster Funkdienst. I'm sorry I butchered that word to my native German speakers. I tried my best, but cold reads will do that to you sometimes. Got a non-emergency call from a mother telling me her daughter, who was home alone, called her mom and said that someone just kicked in her front door and she was hiding under her bed with the person roaming through the house. So I dispatched all my units, in which they got there in about 2 minutes, and just turned out that it was the landlord. That gave 24-hour notice to come fix a light. Definitely an emergency that turned out to be nothing. Mom should have called 911 in that situation. I'm an ambulance dispatcher, so most of my calls are through the emergency line, but I also take overflow from our non-emergency line. Got a lot of stories of emergency non-emergencies, and you'd be surprised by the amount of elderly people that call through on that line where they can sit on hold for a bit if we're busy and have chest pains with DIB but don't want to be a bother. Not exactly a dispatcher, but definitely a non-emergency line operator. I was working at the cable phone company in sales and received a call from an elderly gentleman. He started talking about how his wife had fallen and he's pretty sure hit her head. He got her in a chair, but she wouldn't stand and seemed confused. He wasn't sure what to do next. I was just so caught off guard and confused as to how this man reached me and what was happening. I soon realized he had dialed 611 rather than 911, which, in America, routes you to your phone provider. I didn't have the ability to dial 911 for him due to our phone systems, but advised him as to what to do. I just can't believe he got through all the menu prompts, etc., to get me to still think it was an emergency line. Something non-dispatchers may not realize is that calls aren't transferred properly, or if someone is transferred from agencies without direct access to your 911 line, calls come in non-emergency. This is just a super brief PSA on why, if you are able to call 911, please do so. Don't have your cousin in the next state over or something call for you. It's going to get routed weird and waste precious time. Hence, I was still in non-emergency training, learning about how to take noise complaints and questions about paperwork, when I suddenly had a man yelling about his son not breathing. I was so not prepared. It still can be kind of jarring to be expecting a routine administrative call and suddenly have a full-scale emergency on the line. Since being a full-fledged dispatcher, the worst call in which someone actually dialed our non-emergency line that comes to mind was a lady saying her son had been in a single car accident. She kept rambling on with all kinds of information that wasn't really pertinent to anything. After a little bit, as a formality, I interrupted to say, "Just confirming there are no injuries?" She responded, "No. Well, he does have glass in his eyes." The dude legit had glass shards in his eyeballs, and Mom decided that was not noteworthy info to this call. As soon as she finally mentioned that, medics were dispatched. I'm a dispatcher. I've had someone call in a legit breaking and entering on non-emergency. A lot of domestics, a few shots fired calls. Mostly, we deal with people who have called 911 for something that is 100% not emergent. 911, what is your emergency? Hi, my car was towed. Or, I need to make a noise complaint. Non-medical related. Back in the 90s, used to be a dispatcher in a telecommunications operations center in the UK. One day I'm sitting there with not so much going on and a fault condition lights up. Several hundred customers just say that service go down for some inexplicable reason. No alarm codes indicating a failure condition, just a slew of random alarms immediately followed by a complete loss of communications with this particular node, which is usually controlled via equipment in a large metal cabinet that sits on a street corner in a neighborhood. So my shift partner and I are trying to figure out what might have happened while the main call center starts receiving calls from a disgruntled customers. The non-emergency phone rings. I pick up, and on the other end is an enormously polite man. "Good morning, is this my company?" "Yes, it is. How may I help you?" "This is Sergeant Name with the Territorial Army. I'm terribly sorry. I think we may have damaged some of your equipment." "I see. Can you tell me where it's located?" "Right now, it's located between 100 and 200 on Street Name. It's a bit spread out." "I'm very sorry, mate. I'm afraid we ran it over with a tank." Now, for those of you who live in the UK, it was a reasonably common sight, at least in my town, to see the Territorial Army, this is like the National Guard in the US, driving tanks and other vehicles on the roads, not on trucks. Apparently, a relatively new driver had ridden up on the side of the road and utterly annihilated our equipment, spreading it across an entire residential street. It took the next 3 days, with all of my on-calls and other techs, to get service back. It's one thing to have to replace a board or a connection in a cabinet. It's something else entirely to have to re-provision an entire node with guys splicing hundreds of fiber optic cables for hours and hours. TL, DR. My quiet day in a knock got ruined by a noob with a tank. An inexperienced tank driver driving a tank in a residential neighborhood? That's military intelligence at its finest. A tornado hit a nearby town, and the influx of calls was too great for their county to handle, so I got the overflow. I took dozens of calls from a city I wasn't familiar with people screaming about being buried in rubble or saying that they couldn't find their child. One man said his neighbors were gone because they lived in a manufactured home next door and the entire thing was missing. Not knocked down or heavily damaged, missing as if it was snapped out of existence. That couple died. Not a great day. And for levity, this one should have caused more emergencies but didn't. We had a minor earthquake once, 5.2. This was shortly after 4:30 in the morning. I had dozens of 911 calls that went like this. 911, what is your emergency? Did we just have an earthquake? Yes, what is your emergency? Thinking a wall collapsed, someone is hurt, gas leak, etc. Oh, I don't have an emergency. I just wondered if it was an earthquake. My favorite of these was the woman who called about 5 minutes after it happened and goes, "Oh, what was it on the Richter scale?" I was frustrated and said sarcastically, "I don't know, ma'am. Our seismometer is broken." She says, "Oh." She wasn't smart enough to get the sarcasm.